What happens when desperation meets power in the most unexpected way? Daphne Collins thought she was breaking into an empty mansion to escape dangerous creditors. She came face to face with Grayson Thorne, one of the most powerful and ruthless billionaires in the country. What starts as a chance encounter becomes a deadly arrangement that will change both their lives forever. Welcome back. Beautiful people. Today's story is equal parts drama and devotion, and trust us, you'll be hooked from the very first line. Let's see how one meeting changed everything. The blood on Daphne Collins. Hands hadn't dried yet when she pressed the stolen keys into the lock of the mansion's front door. She hadn't meant for things to go this far. The plan had been simple: break into the empty house, grab something valuable, and disappear before anyone noticed. But Marcus had been waiting in the shadows, and when he'd lunged at her with that knife, instinct had taken over. Now he was bleeding out on the marble steps of some billionaire's estate. She was about to hide inside like the criminal she'd apparently become. The door swung open with barely a whisper, revealing a foyer that belonged in a museum rather than someone's home. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fragments across walls lined with original paintings, and the scent of expensive leather and fresh orchids hung thick in the air. Daphne's worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble as she stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. She needed to think. Marcus would live. His wound hadn't looked deep enough to kill him, just enough to send him running. But he'd seen her face, knew her name, and worse. He knew about the debt she owed to people who didn't accept apologies as payment. 24 hours, she whispered to herself, the same words she'd been repeating like a mantra for weeks. All she had left before Vincent Moretti's men came collecting, and she was still $12,000 short. The house stretched before her like a promise and a threat. Everything here probably cost more than she'd see in 10 lifetimes, but moving any of it would take time she didn't have. She needed cash, jewelry, something small and untraceable. Sound from deeper in the house made her freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged here. Panic clawed up her throat as she realized her fatal mistakes. She'd assumed the house was empty, because that's what Marcus had told her. But Marcus had been wrong about a lot of things, starting with how easy this job would be. "I know you're in here." The voice that echoed through the foyer was deep, controlled, with an edge that suggested its owner wasn't used to being disobeyed. Daphne's breath caught as a man emerged from the shadows of the grand staircase, moving like a predator who'd cornered his prey. He was tall, probably 6'3", with the kind of presence that filled a room before he'd even fully entered. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the late hour, and his gray eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who made his living reading people's weaknesses. He wore an expensive black suit that fit him like armor, every line tailored to emphasize the power he carried in his broad shoulders and controlled movements. But it was his face that made her stomach drop. She'd seen it in newspapers, on magazine covers, splashed across financial websites. Grayson Thorne, the youngest. Billionaire in the city, known for hostile takeovers and a reputation for destroying anyone who crossed him. "You picked the wrong house to rob," he said, stopping just close enough that she could smell his college something dark and expensive that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Daphne's mind raced through her options. The front door was behind her, but he stood between her and any other exit. She could run, but he looked like he kept himself in shape, and her wounded shoulder from Marcus's knife would slow her down. She could lie, but something in his eyes told her he'd see through any story she tried to spin. So she chose the truth, or at least part of it. "I'm not here to rob you," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm here to hide." His eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his composed expression. "Hide from what?" "It's from the kind of people who don't care that I never wanted to be in debt to them in the first place." Grayson studied her with the intensity of someone used to analyzing threats and opportunities. His gaze lingered on the blood staining her jacket sleeve, the way she favored her left shoulder, the expensive laptop bag slung across her body. That clearly didn't belong to her. "You're hurt," he said, and something in his tone shifted. Not softer exactly, but curious. "It's not my blood," she admitted, then immediately wished she hadn't. A smile ghosted across his lips, but it wasn't. warm. It was the kind of expression that suggested he'd just found something unexpectedly interesting. So you can fight when I have to, and do you? Have to, I mean. Often the question hung between them like a challenge. Daphne felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her shoulders, scholarship she'd lost, the medical bills that had started this whole mess, the desperation that had led her to Marcus and his promises of easy money. More often than I'd like, she said. Grayson nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd suspected. Then he did something that surprised her completely. He stepped aside, clearing the path to the door. You should leave, he said, before I decide to call the police. But Daphne didn't move. Something in his voice told her he wasn't going to call anyone, and the thought of walking back out into the night, back to Vincent's men and the debt that would follow her until it killed her, felt worse than staying. Here with a dangerous stranger. What if I don't want to leave? She asked. His eyes narrowed. I'd say you're either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both. This time his smile was real, transforming his face from coldly handsome to something far more dangerous. It was the expression of a man who just recognized a kindred spirit. Someone else who understood that sometimes the biggest risks offered the only chance at survival. In that case, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, we should probably discuss what you're really running from. Daphne's pulse quickened as she realized she'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the life she'd known before tonight. And from the way Grayson was looking at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve, she had a feeling her problems were just beginning. Grayson's home office felt like a war room, all sharp edges and dark leather, with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a glittering battlefield spread out below. Daphne sat in the chair across from his massive mahogany desk, trying not to show how the luxury intimidated her while he cleaned the cut on her shoulder. With medical supplies that probably cost more than most people's insurance deductibles, his touch was surprisingly gentle for someone with such a reputation for ruthlessness. She could feel the controlled strength in his hands, the way he worked with the precision of someone used to handling delicate things that could break if he applied too much pressure. Vincent Moretti, he said, not looking up from his work. It wasn't a question. Daphne's breath caught. You know him? Everyone in this city knows Vincent. The question is how a computer science graduate student ended up owing money to a loan shark who specializes in breaking kneecaps. She jerked away from his touch, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. How do you know what I study? Grayson's gray eyes met hers, and she saw something calculating in their depths. Your laptop bag has MIT stickers on it. Your hands show calluses from typing, not manual labor. And you carry yourself like someone used to being the smartest person in the room, which means you're either in tech or academia, since you're young enough to still have that idealistic edge, I'm guessing student. The accuracy of his assessment made her skin crawl. Congratulations, Sherlock, you missed your calling as a detective. I didn't miss anything, he said, returning his attention to her shoulder. I chose a different path for getting information. About people. There was something in his tone that made her study his face more carefully. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the tension he carried in the set of his jaw. This was a man who'd learned to read people as a matter of survival, not curiosity. My father was dying, she said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. Cancer. The experimental treatment wasn't covered by insurance. Grayson's hands, stilled on her shoulder, died 3 months ago. Turns out, borrowing $50,000 from Vincent doesn't actually guarantee a cure. He finished bandaging her shoulder in silence, his movements careful and methodical. When he was done, he moved back to his chair, putting the width of the desk between them like a barrier. $50,000 to Vincent becomes how much after 3 months? He asked. 62. And you have? Daphne laughed, but there was no humor in it. Counting loose change? Maybe 300. Grayson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he studied her. The gesture was probably meant to look casual, but she could see the predator lurking beneath his composed surface, calculating odds and opportunities. I could pay Vincent tomorrow, he said. Wipe the debt clean. Her heart stopped. Why would you do that? Because I need something, and you have skills I can use. The way he said it made warning bells ring in her head. Men like Grayson Thorne didn't offer help without expecting something substantial in return. And she'd already made enough deals with devils to last several lifetimes. What kind of skills? Instead of answering, he turned his computer monitor around so she could see the screen. Financial records, encrypted files, what looked like corporate communications marked with security classifications she recognized from her cybersecurity courses. My company is being targeted, he said. Industrial espionage, coordinated attacks on our servers, attempts to steal research data worth hundreds of millions. My security team is competent, but they're thinking defensively. I need someone who understands how criminals operate. Daphne stared at the screen, her mind automatically analyzing the attack patterns she could see in the data logs. It was sophisticated work, the kind that required serious resources and planning. Not the sloppy desperation that had driven her to break into his house tonight. This isn't random, she said. Someone with serious money is funding this. Very good. And that someone has been careful to cover their tracks through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts. Traditional investigation methods have hit dead ends. She looked up from the screen to meet his eyes. So you want me to use less traditional methods? Want you to think like the criminal you've proven you can be when necessary? The words stung, but she couldn't argue with their accuracy. And in exchange, Vincent gets paid, your debt disappears, and you get a clean slate. It sounded too good to be true, which in her experience meant it was. What's the catch? Grayson smiled, and she was reminded of every cautionary tale about making deals with beautiful devils. The catch is that if you betray me, if you take my money and run, or if you're working for whoever's attacking my company, I will destroy you so completely that Vincent Moretti will seem like a fond memory. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd shouted. This was a man who'd built an empire by understanding exactly how to leverage people's fears and desires. And she was walking straight into his web, but the alternative was Vincent's men, and she'd seen what they did to people who couldn't pay their debts. How do I know you'll keep your word? She asked. You don't. But then again, I don't know you won't sell my secrets to the highest bidder. Once you have access to them, I suppose we'll have to trust each other. But trust. The word felt foreign coming from someone who'd made his fortune by outmaneuvering competitors and crushing anyone who stood in his way. But as she looked at him across the expanse of his desk, she realized something that made her stomach flutter with an emotion she couldn't quite name. He was taking as big a risk on her as she was on him. Okay, she said. I'll do it. Just like that? Just like that? Grayson reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a contract that looked like it had been prepared by an army of lawyers. Sign this, and Vincent's debt disappears within 24 hours. You'll have full access to my security systems and a workspace here in the house. But once you sign, you belong to me until this is finished. The way he said belong to me sent heat racing through her veins, though she told herself it was just the adrenaline from everything that had happened tonight. She picked up the pen he offered, noting that it probably cost more than most people's car payments. One more thing, she said, pausing with the pen hovering over the signature line. Earlier, when you found me in your house, you said I should leave before you decided to call the police. But you never really intended to call them, did you? His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. What makes you say that? Because men like you don't call the police when they find something interesting? You keep it for yourself and figure out how to use it. And what kind of man do you think I am exactly? Daphne met his gaze steadily, seeing herself reflected in the gray depths of his eyes. The dangerous kind, just like me. She signed her name with a flourish. Ceiling. A bargain that felt less like salvation and more like stepping off a cliff with no idea how far she'd fall. As Grayson took the contract back, his fingers brushed hers. And she felt the spark of connection that had been building between them since the moment he'd stepped out of the shadows. Whatever game they were about to play together, she had, feeling the rules were going to be more complicated than either of them expected. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Daphne had mapped every digital vulnerability in Grayson's empire and traced the attacks to their source. She'd also discovered that working 18-hour days alongside someone as brilliant and ruthless as Grayson Thorne was like playing with fire while doused in gasoline. The chemistry between them had been building since that first night, manifesting in lingering glances across the war room they'd set up in his study, in the brush of fingers when he handed her coffee at 3 a.m, in the way his voice dropped to something almost intimate when he leaned over her shoulder to examine code on her screen. What it was the quiet moments that were dangerous. When he'd find her asleep at her computer and drape his jacket over her shoulders, when she'd catch him staring out the windows at the city below. Something haunted in his expression that made her want to ask questions she knew he wouldn't answer. Tonight felt different. The breakthrough she'd been chasing for weeks was finally within reach, hidden in encrypted communications between shell companies that led back to a name that made everything click into place. "I found him," she announced, spinning her chair to face where Grayson stood reading reports by the window. He looked up, and she saw the intensity that had made him a legend in corporate circles focus entirely on her. "Show me." She pulled up the network analysis on the main screen, highlighting the connection points that revealed the pattern she'd been tracking. "The attacks aren't random. They're specifically targeting your artificial intelligence research. The project you've been keeping compartmentalized from the rest of your company." Grayson moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. "That project is classified at the highest levels. Only 3 people have complete access." "4 people," Daphne corrected, pulling up a personnel file. "You, your CTO Marcus Webb, your head of security Sarah Chen, and your business partner David Sterling." She watched Grayson's face as the implications sank in. One of the people he trusted most had been systematically betraying him for months, stealing research that could reshape entire industries. "David," he said quietly, and something in his voice made her chest tighten. "You weren't just business partners, were you?" Grayson was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on David's photo in the personnel file. "We built this company together. Started in my garage when we were barely out of college, survived 3 near bankruptcies, celebrated every victory." He paused, jaw tightening. "He's my best friend." Or was. Daphne had expected anger, the cold fury she'd seen him direct at competitors who made the mistake of underestimating him. Instead, she heard something raw and wounded that made her want to reach out and touch his hand. "There's more," she said gently. "The timing of the attacks corresponds with your company's acquisition negotiations with several major tech firms. Someone's been feeding Sterling information about your negotiation strategies, your reserve prices, everything. Which means every deal we've made in the past year has been compromised." His laugh was bitter. "David's been playing both sides, using my own research to undercut me while positioning himself as the reasonable alternative when potential partners found my terms too aggressive." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Sterling hadn't just been stealing intellectual property, he had been orchestrating a long-term campaign to isolate Grayson, undermine his reputation, and ultimately force him out of his own company. "I'm sorry," Daphne said, meaning it more than she'd expected to. Grayson looked at her then, really looked at her. She saw something vulnerable in his expression that he usually kept hidden behind layers of corporate armor. "Are you? Or is this just part of the job?" Question hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, this had stopped being just a job for her. Working beside him, seeing the brilliant mind behind the ruthless reputation, watching him care more deeply about his work and the people who depended on him than he let anyone seat, had become something else entirely. "It stopped being just a job the night you chose to trust me instead of calling the police," she admitted. Something shifted in the air between them, an acknowledgement of what had been building since the moment they'd met. Grayson stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "This complicates things," he said, his voice rough. "Everything about us is complicated." He reached out, his fingers trailing along her jaw with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the power she knew he was capable of wielding. "You realize there's no going back from this? Once I deal with David, once this is over, you'll know too much about how I operate, about who I really am." Daphne leaned into his touch, her heart racing at the implication in his words. "Maybe I don't want to go back." That broke the last of his control. His mouth crashed down on hers, hungry and desperate. 3 weeks of carefully maintained professional distance, dissolving in an instant. She responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt as he pressed her back against the desk. But even as heat flooded her system, part of her mind was still working, still processing the information she'd uncovered. And suddenly, a detail that had been nagging at her clicked into place with horrible clarity. She broke away from the kiss, her breathing ragged. "Grayson, wait. What is it?" Daphne turned back to her computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up financial records she'd almost dismissed as irrelevant. The shell companies Sterling's using to funnel information, they're not just connected to him. "What do you mean?" Her stomach dropped as the connections became clear.
The primary funding source. It's not coming from outside competitors.
It's coming from inside your own company. Someone's been using corporate accounts to finance the attacks. Grayson leaned over her shoulder, his body tense, as he scanned the data. "That's impossible. I have oversight on all major expenditures." "Not these accounts," Daphne said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These are executive discretionary funds, accounts that only require one signature for approval." She highlighted the authorization codes, and Grayson went very still behind her. She could feel the exact moment he realized what she was showing him, could almost hear his world reshaping itself around this new, terrible reality. "Those are my authorization codes," he said. "Hey." Daphne turned to face him, seeing the dawning horror in his eyes. "Grayson, someone's been using your own access to fund the attacks against your company. They're not just stealing your research share, making you pay for your own destruction." The full scope of the betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity. Sterling hadn't just been feeding information to competitors she'd been using Grayson's own resources to finance a campaign designed to destroy him while leaving a trail of evidence. That would make it look like Grayson had orchestrated his own downfall. "If this gets out," Grayson said slowly, "it won't matter that I'm innocent. The board will have no choice but to remove me. Sterling gets control of the company, the research, everything. You get destroyed in the process," Daphne finished. They stared at each other across the dim glow of the computer screens, both understanding that they'd just crossed into territory far more dangerous than corporate espionage. This was a perfect frame job, years in the making, and they were running out of time to stop it. Grayson's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it and his face went pale. "What is it?" Daphne asked. "Emergency board meeting. Tomorrow morning. David's calling for a vote of no confidence." The trap was closing, and they had less than 12 hours to find a way out. The boardroom felt like a courtroom as Daphne watched Grayson defend his empire against men who'd already decided his fate. She sat in the gallery behind bulletproof glass, officially there as his cybersecurity consultant, but really there because neither of them could bear to face this alone. David Sterling commanded the room with the easy charisma that had made him a legend in venture capital circles. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit cut to emphasize the authority. He'd built over 2 decades of successful deals. When he spoke, board members leaned forward, drawn to the reasonable tone that had convinced them to trust him with their investments. "The evidence is overwhelming," David said, gesturing to the financial reports displayed on the conference. "Rooms, screens. Grayson has been systematically draining company resources to fund attacks on our own systems. Whether this was an attempt to justify increased security budgets or something more sinister, I can't say. What I can tell you is that we cannot allow this to continue." Daphne's hands clenched in her lap as she watched Grayson's face remain impassive, giving nothing away. They'd spent all night preparing for this, building their counter-argument, gathering evidence to prove his innocence. But David had been planning this for years, and his presentation was flawless. "The authorization codes are genuine," David continued. "The financial transfers are documented, and the timing correlates perfectly with Grayson's increasingly erratic behavior over the past several months. Erratic." Grayson's voice was deadly quiet. David's expression softened into something that might have looked like concern to someone who didn't know better. The late-night security alerts, the paranoid demands for increased surveillance, the isolation from the management team. "Grayson, we're worried about you." It was masterfully done. Every piece of evidence that proved Grayson was investigating, the attacks now looked like proof that he was orchestrating them. His discovery of the security breaches became paranoid delusions. His attempts to identify the source became the actions of a man covering his tracks. Daphne felt sick watching it unfold, seeing how David turned Grayson's greatest strengths into apparent weaknesses. His intelligence became obsessive behavior. His dedication became unhealthy fixation. Even his success was reframed as the desperate actions of someone trying to maintain control at any cost. "I'd like to call a witness," Grayson said, standing. With the controlled grace that had intimidated boardrooms for years, David's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "That's not necessary. The evidence speaks for itself." "The evidence tells a story," Grayson corrected, "but not the whole story." We gestured toward the glass partition, and Daphne felt her stomach drop as every eye in the room turned to her. This wasn't part of the plan. They'd agreed she would remain in the background. Her involvement kept minimal to protect both of them. "Ms. Collins has been conducting an independent investigation of our security breaches," Grayson continued. "Her findings paint a very different picture of recent events." Daphne entered the boardroom on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of the powerful men studying her like a specimen under a microscope. She'd faced down loan sharks and survived in environments where showing weakness meant death, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of their collective scrutiny. "Ms. Collins," David said, his voice warm and welcoming, "we appreciate your expertise in this matter, though I have to ask about your qualifications for such a sensitive investigation." Question landed like a carefully aimed blade. Daphne felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized David knew exactly who she was, knew about Vincent Moretti, and the circumstances that had brought her here. "I have a master's degree in cybersecurity from MIT," she said, keeping her voice steady, "and I have experience thinking like the people who perpetrate these kinds of attacks." "Yes," David said, consulting a tablet in front of him. "We've done some research into your background. It's quite extensive criminal connections for someone supposedly working on our security." The room went very quiet. Daphne could feel Grayson's tension from across the room, could see the trap David had laid for both of them with surgical precision. "Miss Collins owes a substantial debt to Vincent Moretti," David continued, his voice taking on the sympathetic tone of someone delivering bad news. "She was caught breaking into Grayson's home 3 weeks ago, and now she's presenting evidence that conveniently absolves the man who's been paying her bills." Every word was true, and every word was devastating. The board members were no longer looking at her like an expert witness. They were looking at her like a criminal whose testimony couldn't be trusted. "The question becomes," David said, turning to address the board directly, "whether Grayson orchestrated these attacks himself, or whether he's being manipulated by someone with a significant financial incentive to tell him what he wants to hear." Daphne felt the walls closing in around her. David had turned her greatest asset, their understanding of criminal behavior, into a proof that she couldn't be trusted. Worse, he'd made her relationship with Grayson look like evidence of his corruption, rather than his judgment. "That's enough," Grayson said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the board members. "Is it?" David asked, and now his mask was slipping, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the surface. "'Cause I think the board deserves to know the full extent of your recent decisions. The woman you've been living with, the debts you've paid on her behalf, the security access you've given to someone with documented criminal connections." Grayson moved toward the front of the room, and Daphne saw something dangerous in his expression. "You want to discuss criminal connections, David? Let's discuss yours." David's smile never wavered, but his eyes went flat. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts." Grayson turned to address the board. "David Sterling has been systematically stealing our research, selling it to competitors, and using our own resources to finance attacks on our systems." "Those are serious accusations," David said. "Do you have proof?" Realized the full scope of David's trap. He'd known they would uncover his involvement. He'd planned for it, prepared for it, and turned it into another weapon against Grayson, because without her testimony, they had circumstantial evidence at best. Financial records that could be explained away, communication patterns that proved nothing definitive. David had been too careful, too smart, and now he'd discredited their only witness. "I see," David said when Grayson didn't immediately respond. "More accusations based on the word of someone we've established has significant reasons to lie." The board was turning. Daphne could see it in their faces, the way they were withdrawing from Grayson, beginning to view him as a liability rather than an asset. David had orchestrated this perfectly, using her past against both of them in a way that made every piece of evidence look like manipulation. "I call for an immediate vote," David said. "It's for the good of the company and all our investors. Grayson Thorne must be removed as CEO." "Seconded," came a voice from across the table. Daphne watched the man she'd come to care about more than she'd thought possible face the destruction of everything he'd built, knowing that her presence had made it inevitable. David had used her as a weapon against him, turned her love into proof of his corruption. But as the board began to discuss voting procedures, she realized something that made her blood run cold. She looked at David, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that didn't match his words. He wasn't just satisfied with winning, he was enjoying watching Grayson fall. This wasn't about business or corporate control. This was personal, and it had been from the beginning. David Sterling hadn't just betrayed his business partner, he'd been planning to destroy his best friend for years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to take everything Grayson had built and tear it down. The vote was called, one by one. The board members who had once celebrated Grayson's victories raised their hands to cast him out. As Daphne watched the man she loved lose everything, she knew that she was the reason it had all been possible. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum in the hours after Grayson's empire crumbled. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the city lights that no longer looked like conquered territory, but like a world that had moved on. Without him, Daphne watched him from across the room, her heart breaking at the stillness in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man trying not to shatter. The vote had been unanimous. By morning, David Sterling would be CEO, and Grayson Thorne would be just another cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate against the magnitude of what had been lost. He didn't turn around. "Are you?" The question hit her like a physical blow. How can you even ask that? Because everything David said in that boardroom was true. His voice was eerily calm, controlled in a way that scared her more than anger would have. "You are a criminal. You did break into my house. You do owe your freedom to my money. You think that means I wanted this to happen?" Now he did turn, and the emptiness in his gray eyes made her step backward. "I think it means you were the perfect weapon to use against me, whether you knew it or not." The accusation hung between them like a blade. Daphne felt something vital tear inside her chest as she realized he was pulling away, rebuilding the walls she'd thought they'd torn down together. "You don't believe that?" she said. "Don't I? You show up at exactly the right time, with exactly the right skills, and exactly the right vulnerabilities?" "David's been planning this for years, Daphne. Don't you think it's possible he arranged for us to meet?" The suggestion was so perfectly, horribly plausible that she felt sick. Marcus, the man she'd fought outside Grayson's house, the one who'd given her the address and the story about an empty mansion, what if he'd been working for David all along? What if her desperation had been anticipated, manipulated, used as the opening move in a game she'd never even known she was playing? "Even if that's true," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "it doesn't change what happened between us. It doesn't change what I feel, what you feel." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What you feel is gratitude. Stockholm Syndrome. The natural response to someone who saved you from a situation you couldn't escape on your own. That's not true, isn't it? Tell me, Daphne, I hadn't paid your debt if I hadn't given you a place to hide. Would you have looked twice at a man like me? Or would you have seen exactly what David wanted the board to see, a ruthless bastard who destroys anyone who gets in his way? She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. Because there was truth in what he was saying, even if it wasn't the whole truth. She had been grateful. She had been dependent on his protection. Maybe in the beginning that had colored everything else. But somewhere along the way, it had become something more, something real. "You're right," she said quietly. He went very still. "What? You're right about all of it." "I was grateful. I was dependent on you, and maybe that's how it started. She stepped closer, refusing to let him retreat. But that's not how it ended. I fell in love with you, Grayson. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are when you think no one's watching. Because you chose trust over suspicion. Because you saw potential in someone everyone else would have written off. Because you fight for what matters even when the odds are impossible. Something cracked in his composure, a flash of pain that made her want to reach for him. But before she could move, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at it, and his face went white. What is it? Instead of answering, he turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a news alert, already spreading across social media with the kind of viral velocity that destroyed lives in real time. Tech mogul's criminal girlfriend, inside the scandal that brought down Grayson Thorne. The article had everything. Photos of her entering the mansion, details about her debt to Vincent Moretti, even speculation about her role in the corporate espionage. Someone had leaked the story within hours of the board meeting, ensuring that even if Grayson tried to fight back, his reputation would be too damaged to recover. David, she breathed. One final twist of the knife, Grayson confirmed. By tomorrow, you'll be the face of corporate corruption, and I'll be the fool who let a criminal destroy his company. Daphne stared at the phone, watching her past become a weapon aimed at both of them. Comments were already pouring in, each one more vicious than the last. Her photo would be on every news site, her name associated with scandal and betrayal. But as she read the article more carefully, she realized something that made her heart race with possibility rather than terror. Grayson, she said, her voice urgent. Look at the byline. He frowned, focusing on the small print at the top of the article. Sarah Chen, investigative journalist, your head of security. The one person besides you, David and Marcus, who had complete access to the AI research. Understanding dawned. In his eyes, she's been working with David all along. More than that, she's been feeding him information about your security concerns, your investigation methods, everything. That's how he stayed one step ahead. Daphne's mind was racing, connecting pieces they'd missed in their focus on the financial trail. And now, she's burning both of us to cover her tracks. But even as they unraveled the final layer of David's conspiracy, Daphne knew it was too late. The story was out, the damage done. Even proof of their innocence wouldn't undo what had been set in motion. There is one way, she said quietly. Grayson looked at her, and she saw him reach the same conclusion she had. No, he said immediately. Absolutely not. It's the only way to save your company, your reputation. I don't care about any of that if it means losing you. But Daphne had already made her decision. She'd spent her whole life running from consequences, letting other people pay for her mistakes. Her father had died trying to buy her a future she'd squandered. Grayson had lost everything because she'd made him vulnerable. I care, she said. I care about the thousands of people who work for your company, who'll lose their jobs if David runs it into the ground. I care about the research that could change the world if it falls into the right hands. And I care about you too much too. Let you sacrifice all of that for someone like me. She was already moving toward the door, but he caught her arm. Daphne, don't do this. I have to. You know I have to. Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes next. She reached up to touch his face, memorizing the sharp angles. The gray eyes that had seen through every defense she'd built, together. Means we both burn. Apart means you have a chance to rebuild. I don't want to rebuild without you, well, she said, and kissed him one last time, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. You'll rebuild, and you'll be stronger than before, and someday you'll understand why this was the only choice. She left while she still could, walking out of the penthouse and into the elevator that would carry her down to street level, where reporters were already gathering like vultures. By morning, she would be gone. Vincent Moretti's debt had been paid, but there were other cities, other identities, other ways to disappear when staying meant destroying the person you loved most. Grayson would fight the charges, would find a way to expose David's conspiracy, would slowly rebuild what had been taken from him, because that's what men like him did. They endured. They adapted. They conquered. and Daphne would become what she'd always be in a ghost story. Cautionary tale. A woman who'd loved a powerful man and paid the price for it. 6 months later, she read about Grayson's vindication in a newspaper in a small coastal town 3,000 miles away. Sarah Chen had been arrested. David Sterling was facing federal charges. Thorne Industries was back under its founder's control, stronger than ever. The article included a photo of Grayson at a press conference, looking every inch the conquering CEO. But Daphne knew him well enough to see what others missed: shadows under his eyes, the careful way he held himself, the absence of something that had once burned bright. She folded the newspaper and walked to the edge of the pier, letting the ocean breeze carry away the tears she'd refused to shed for 6 months. She'd given him back his empire, his reputation, his future. She kept his heart, and hers would always belong to a man she could never see again. In the distance, seagulls called to each other across the waves, their voices carrying messages of love and loss into the endless blue sky. Like this video if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. Let us know in the comments. Love connecting with our global community of romance lovers. The end.